The domain of a function is what you can put into the machine without it breaking down. So for example, let's look at this function 1 over x. We've seen that the graph of 1 over x looks like this. We've already seen this. So you can imagine a function as being like a machine. You input a number, let's say you input 3, well you would put 3 into here. So that would give you 1 over 3. So if you put a 3 into the machine, it will spit out this number 1 over 3. If you put in a 5 into this machine, it will spit out the number 1/5. Or if you put in 0.27, then it will spit out the number 1 over 0.27. If you put in the number 1 over 8, it will spit out the number 8 because if you put this into here, it would be 1 divided by 1 over 8. Well, this number here, 1 divided by 1 over 8, equals 1 times 8 over 1. Well, 1 times anything, it will be the same as this, and then this is the number 8. We've seen this before. I'm expecting you to know this. But the point is that a domain of a function is what you can put into the machine without the machine breaking down. So is there a number that will break down this machine? Well, if I try and put in the number 0, 1 divided by 0, you're not allowed to divide by 0. So this, if you try and put 0 into the machine will break down. So don't go putting 0 into the machine. You see, the number 0 is not in the domain. Everything else is in the domain. You can put any number into the machine and it won't break down. But the minute you put 0 into the machine, it will break down. That's why the graph has a sort of like a gap in between. Well, you've got some sort of gap at 0. So don't go putting 0 into the machine. The number 0 is not in the domain. So when you come to specify the domain for this function, you would have to write this: domain dot dot x can be anything on the real number line, comma, and then specify your condition. Well, make sure x does not equal 0. So this is this is how you would state the domain. So the domain is a way for you to communicate to other people what you can and can't put into the machine. So basically, you can put anything on the real number line. So remember, our number line looks like this: 0, 1, 2, 3, -1, and so on. And remember, we've seen that but when you reach an age of 16 or 17, you will be introduced to what's called complex numbers. So this will be I, 2i, and so on, -i. What this is saying is you can select any number on this line. Just don't go putting a complex number into the machine, otherwise it will break down. So for example, this number here, 3 plus 2i, well, this here is a number. Well, don't go putting this number into the machine, otherwise the machine will break down. So by you specifying this, you're communicating to other people that you can put any number on this number line, but make sure it doesn't equal 0. So don't go putting 0 in there. You can even select 2.7. That's okay. You can select -3.2 if you want to, because it's on this line. Just make sure you don't put 0 into the machine. So the domain for this function is given by this. So let me give you another example. So we've seen the square root of x. The square root of x graph looks like this. We've already seen this. If you go putting the number 9 into the machine, it will spit out the number 3. If you put in the number 4, it will spit out the number 2. If you select 4, it will spit out the number 2. If you put in a 9 into the machine, it will spit out the number 3. We've already seen this. So when you come to state the domain for this function, you've got to think about what will break the machine down. So for example, if I were to say, let's say -4, if I put -4 into the machine, it will actually break down, because when I ask for the square root of -4, in your mind you've got to think of two numbers that are the same. When you square them together, it will give you -4. So you can try -2 negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 2 will give you a positive 4. It doesn't actually give me a negative 4. I want a negative 4. So you can't really square root a negative number. So if you try and put a negative 4 into this machine, it will break down. It's okay to put a positive 4, because the square root of positive 4 is 2. So you can put a positive number in there, but if you try and put a negative number in there, it will break down. You see, the number negative 4 is not in the domain. So you can put any positive number in there, but don't go putting a negative number in there. You can even you can actually put in the number 0. You see, the number 0 is in the domain, because what is the square root of 0? So in your mind, you've got to think of two numbers that are exactly the same. When you multiply them together, it gives you 0. Well, 0 times 0 is 0. So 0 is you can square root a 0. It would be 0. So 0 is in the domain. But don't go try and square rooting. Don't try and square root a negative number. So our domain in our case here, domain, and then dot dot. X can be anything on the real number line, but just make sure that x does not equal 0. And remember that there are lots of ways of stating the domain. This way is just one of the many ways you can use. There are other ways of specifying the domain. So the domain for this function, square root of x, can be written as this. Okay. So another example. The domain for this, if I put in a, we've already seen this graph. This graph looks like this. We've already seen this. If you put in a 3 into the machine, 2 to the power 3 is 8. So it will spit out the number 8. If you put in let's say, a negative 2, you see negative 2 is in the domain. 2 to the power of negative 2, we don't understand what it means to have a power of a negative 2, so we jump to 1 over 2 to the power of the positive version. This is actually 1 over 4. So we spit out the number. If you try and put in negative 2 into the machine, it will spit out the number 1 over 4. This is okay. It doesn't break down the machine. You can even put in the number 0. You see, 0 is in the domain. 2 to the power of 0 is 1. So we spit out the number. If you put in a 0 into the machine, it will spit out the number 1. So that's okay. You see, the domain for this is anything on the real number line. You can put anything in the real number line. It will work. The machine won't break down. So when you come to specify the domain, dot dot, x can be anything on the real number line. And then normally we would specify a condition, but because this works for any number on the real number line, we just leave it as this. So this is your domain. This is how you would specify the domain for 2 to the power of x. So another example, take my word that that this graph looks like this. Okay, so when you put in let's say a number 9 into the machine, square root of 9 would be 3. 1 divided by 3 would be a third. So we spit out this number 1 over 3. That's okay. The number 9 is okay. But then if you look at the square root, you can't really square root a negative number. So if you try and put in a negative 4 into the machine will break down because you can't square root a negative number. So this negative 4 is not in the domain. It's not in the domain. It belongs outside of the domain, negative 4. So don't go putting negative 4 in there. So you can see that it seems like you can't put any negative numbers in there. The next question is, can you put dead on 0 into the machine? Can I put the number 0 into the machine? You see, you can square root a 0. That's okay. That will then give you, when you try and square root a 0, it will give you 0. But then when it comes to 1 divided by 0, it breaks down. So if you try and put a 0 into the machine, the square root bit is okay. But when you come to do 1 over the square root, 1 over 0, it breaks down. So the whole thing will break down. So you can't put in the number 0 into the machine. So the number 0 is not in the domain. because of this 1 divided by thing. You can't divide it by 0, so the whole thing will break down. So 0 is not in the domain, and also any negative will break the machine down. So don't go putting a negative in there. Okay, so the domain for this function, is anything on the real number line, and it can't be 0 and it can't be negative. So it's really anything on the right hand side of 0. So when you come to specify the domain, it would be domain dot x can be anything on the real number line, comma, and then you have to specify your condition. Our condition here is that x must be strictly bigger than 0. It can't be dead on 0. It can't be dead on 0. It can't be dead on 0. So you have to specify strictly greater than 0. So this is a domain for our function here. Okay, so just a reminder, the domain for the square root of x, you see you can square root of 0, that's okay. So the domain for square root of x is anything on the real number line, and x can be equal to 0. But when you come to look at this, you can't divide by 0. You can't divide by 0. So the domain for this is that x must be strictly greater than 0. So the difference here is that this can be 0 and this is strictly greater than 0. This is not allowed to be 0 because of this 1 divided by thing. Okay, so the domain is what you can put into the machine without the machine breaking down. Okay.